All right, so good morning. We are today's daf is daf nun tet 59. We are at the two dots at the bottom of nun chetam bet, and let me share my screen and we'll get going. So in the Mishnah that we learned a few days ago, so just to give some background, there was a disagreement about whether the daughter of a Kohen could continue eating truma if she was a widow who entered Erusin with a Kohen Gadol, or a divorcee who entered Erusin with a regular Kohen. So here's the issue, right? The issue is that if this daughter of a Kohen has marital relations with somebody she's not allowed to have marital relations with, she becomes a halala who is no longer able to eat truma. But Erusin is only a preliminary step towards marriage, only a preliminary step towards that marital relations. They will not have had marital relations up to that point. And so that is the status. But so there was an argument. Tanakama said that she's not allowed to eat truma. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say she is allowed to eat truma. And the Tanakama we associated with Rabbi Meir. But then it came to the conclusion of that Mishnah. And in the conclusion, everybody was in agreement that if the marriage ended due to divorce or the husband's death, if the wife had only entered Erusin, so meaning that she had never had that marital relationship, that would actually cause her to not be able to eat truma, well, then she can still eat truma. So even according to the opinion that says in anticipation of the expected marital relationship, we're not going to let her eat truma, she goes back to her status of being able to eat truma if in fact she never has that marital relationship. On the other hand, if in fact there was a full marriage with Nisuin, so that there was no issue with them having marital relations, well, then she would not be allowed to eat truma. So now the Gemara is going to turn to discuss, whom a Kohen can marry, which will eventually relate to this portion of our Mishnah. And so we begin at the two dots. Nisarmulu o niskarshu. Again, that's what the end of our Mishnah was talking about. If in these forbidden relationships the women get widowed or divorced. So that's the quote from our Mishnah, but we're going to ask a different question. So Boimine Rabbi Chia bar Yosef Mishmuel. Rabbi Chia bar Yosef asked Shmuel the following question: Kohen Gadol shekidush es hakatana. What's the law about a Kohen Gadol who does Kiddushin with a minor, uvagra tachtav, and then she becomes a bogeres? Now, we have not yet learned the Mishnah that is on the middle or top of Nun Tet Amud Aleph. But in that Mishnah, we will see that that there is an opinion that says that a girl that is older than 12 and a half, that's a bogeres, that's the term bogeres. Bogeres is a girl that's over 12 and a half, is not allowed to, a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry such a person. So the question that Rabbi Chia bar Yosef is asking is, well, when she was less than 12 and a half, that's when they did Kedushin. Now they only want to do Nisuin after she turns 12 and a half. Is that permitted? Okay, so the point is that they got married. The first step of marriage was legal, but now do we say that because she became a bogeres, now she's not allowed to? Or do we say that in fact, no, because the first step was legal, the second step is legal? So Mahu, what's the law as we turn to Nun Tet Amud Aleph? Basar Nisuin Azlina, no Basar Erusin Azlina. Do we say that what determines whether a marriage is permitted is based on the moment of Nisuin, meaning when they go to the chuppah, when they actually finish the marriage process, or is Kedushin, the moment of Erusin, the important point in time? So Amar Lei, so Shmuel says back to Nisuha. Let's take a look at our Mishnah. Nisarmalo o niskarshu. What did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said that if they get, if she's widowed or or divorced, so mina nisuin psulos, if it was already from a state of nisuin, so then she's not allowed to have the truma. I mean, erusin ksheris. But if they'd only done erusin, well, then they're still kosher. So so Rashi says, third line down, alma bepsul kahuna basar nesuin aslinin. So the moment that determines whether or not something is puzzle for a Kohen is based on nesuin. So midelo puzzle almana shenis arsa lekohen gadol v'meis, because we see that a widow who did Eriston with the Kohen Gadol, and then the Kohen Gadol dies, we see that she's not puzzle. So as a result, that must show that there's no state of marriage between them, and that what we should be following is following Nisuin. So Ruchia Bar Yosef says back, I'm not hearing that as a good proof. So Amar Le L'Shavya Chalala Lo Kimiboile. We're not talking about the question of halala, right? So the problem with the woman when she engages in nisuin, the widow who engages in nisuin with a Kohen Gadol, that issue is that she becomes a halala. Well, a halala, deviyahi demishavya halala. Everybody knows that the issue, that this threshold for becoming a halala is for her to have marital relations. So ki kamabayla, but what am I talking about? V'hu isha bivsulaha yikach. It's a different issue. We have the Kohen Gadol is required to take a virgin, and so what is the definition of yikach? So my kicha de kedushin beinan, o kicha de nesuin beinan. There's a kicha, a taking at the moment of kedushin, and there's a taking at the moment of nesuin. So which taking are we talking about? So now, so after originally saying that it should be the Nesuin, so Amar Le, so now Shmuel tries again, and now he's going to cite a different Mishnah and say, well, maybe it's from Erison. So Hanami Tenusua, maybe we've got the following Mishnah. Eris es ha'almana v'nismana lios Kohen Gadol. So what happens? We know that there's a difference between a Kohen and a Kohen Gadol. A Kohen is allowed to marry a widow, but a Kohen Gadol is not. So what happens if a Kohen does kedushin, meaning that they enters erison with a widow, and now after he's entered erison, but before the Nisuin, before they complete the marriage process, so he's appointed Kohen Gadol. So do we allow him to marry or do we not? And the answer is the Mishnah continues, and this is a Mishnah that we'll learn in a few days, in 2 more days. Yichnos, it says he may marry her. So that shows that what happened here. We had a kedushin that was permitted, and then the nesuin was prohibited, and so we say that that because the kedushin was permitted, will allow the nesuin to be completed, even though kedushin and nesuin would have been prohibited for this person. Meaning, if the Kohen was appointed Kohen Gadol before he did kedushin with the widow, he would never be allowed to do kedushin with the widow. So the fact that he did kedushin with the widow before he was appointed enables him to take her as his wife. So too, one might think that with respect to the 12-and-a-half-year-old, when was kedushin done? It was before she was 12-and-a-half. And so at that moment, everything was permitted. But now she's turned 12-and-a-half. And so now let's say that just as the Kohen's allowed to complete, who becomes Kohen Gadol is allowed to complete his marriage with a widow, so too the Kohen Gadol is allowed to complete his marriage to a Bogeres. So Shiny Hassam. That also is not a good proof, Reb Chia Bar Yosef explains, because Diksiv Yikach Isha, it says that he takes as a wife. So the Isha is not necessary in this verse, and so as a result, this is the case of Bogeres. So as a result, maybe we could say that that the taking of the wife is what allows, right? The fact that it says as a wife tells us that there's some case that we're going to permit as a result that might otherwise be prohibited. And so what case are we permitting? So we're going to permit the case of the woman, of the widow who did Erisin with the Kohen before he became Kohen Gadol, and then he gets appointed Kohen Gadol. So 1 second, Hachanamik Siv Isha, but we also have in connection with the fact that it was a Bogeris, that he's not allowed to marry a Bogeris, it says Isha. So maybe we should say that just like for the widow, as long as the original taking was okay, the completion will be okay. So too, we'll say the same thing by a Bogeris. When she was taken, she was not yet 12 and a half. So let's allow the marriage to happen now that she is 12 and a half. Well, achas v'lo shtayim. No, the issue is that we have this one word, isha, and that word can only include one additional thing, one additional case. We're only going to be able to expand to include one. Umara isa. So 1 second, well, what are you seeing that suggests that you should include the woman who was a widow, who got married, who did Kedushin with the regular Kohen, who then becomes a Kohen Gadol, and saying that that's the one we're going to allow? Maybe we should allow the other case, the case where she's under 12 and a half when she does Kedushin, and then she turns 12 and a half, and we're going to let her do Nesuin. So, ha ishtene gufe, v'ha lo ishtene gufe. Well, there's a big difference between the two cases, because when you have the widow case, the woman herself, there's no change in her status. And so as a result, we can allow the marriage to be completed. But when it comes to the Bogeris case, where she turns 12 and a half, there is a change in her physical status. And so maybe so that is the less likely case. So when we have to choose which case we're going to include, we'll include only the case that involves no change to her physical status, i.e. the case where she's a widow. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Mishnah that tells us this whole concept of not marrying a Bogeris. And we'll see that it's not a universal opinion. So Kohen Gadol lo yisa almana, bein almana mina erisin, bein almana mina nesuin. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. Doesn't make a difference whether the widow is because of erisin, meaning that they only did Kedushin, or if they even did Nesuin, meaning that they also went to the chuppah. So lo yisa es a Bogeris. And the Tanna Kama continues that he's not allowed to marry a Bogeris, meaning once she turns 12 and a half, that's too old. We're not going to allow him to marry. And again, that's all based on the fact that the pasuk says that that he needs to take he needs to that the Kohen Gadol isha bivsuleha yikach, that he needs to marry a woman while she is a virgin. And so we're going to understand that means that she's got to be at the very early stage of her virginity. So on the other hand, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's not true that a Kohen Gadol can't marry a Bogeris. Even a Bogeris can marry a Kohen Gadol. Below Yisa es mukatz eitz. But if a woman has a mukatz eitz, is the idea of some object causing her to lose her hymen, and so as a result, if in fact, even if it was not a intercourse that resulted in it, but just a piece of wood that had resulted in the loss of her hymen, the signal of her virginity, well, that also would result in her not being able to marry a Kohen Gadol. So that's the Mishnah, and now let's take a look at the Gemara. So the Gemara is going to suggest that what we just said is obvious with respect to the fact that we can't marry a widow, whether it's from an Erisin or Nesuin. So Tana Rabbanan, and we're going to cite a brisa that says the exact same thing. Almana lo yikach. The Torah tells you the Kohen Gadol can't marry a widow. So bein almana mina erisin, Bein almana min nisuin. It doesn't make a difference whether she's an almana from a widow or from a nisuin. Meaning, once you say you can't marry a widow, doesn't make it. She's a widow no matter whether she married the person, whether she did only kedushin or whether she's done even erusin. She's a widow in both circumstances. So of course it's obvious that that's the case. So pshita, it's obvious. And so the Gemara says, no, I can explain to you why it isn't obvious. So mahu detema leilif almana mitamar. There is, of course, the famous case in Sefer Bereshis where Tamar marries first one son of Yehuda and then another son of Yehuda, and both of them do not act properly, and as a result, they both die. And then she's left to and told to wait until the third son of Yehuda is able to marry her. Well, then, of course, the Yehuda doesn't give her the third son, and so she decides to take things into her own hands, and she goes and ends up appearing as a prostitute that Yehuda ends up taking, and as a result, we end up their descendants, of course, end up being David and eventually Mashiach. So, but the key element that we're trying to get from that story that we have is that during that story, Tamar is referred to as a widow. So Mala Hala Min Nisuin. So there in the Torah, when we use that term widow, we're talking about a widow who had done full marriage because she had relations with the husbands. So Avkan Min Nisuin. So too here it must be that that maybe you might think that we're talking about only widows from Nisuin. Kamash Malan. So that's why the Brisa needs to tell us, and our Mishnah needs to tell us, that in fact all widows are forbidden. So the Ema Hachanami. Well, 1 second. Actually, that seems like a reasonable teaching. Meaning, if the Torah in one place uses the word almana to indicate a widow from Nisuin, meaning from the latter part of marriage, from a complete marriage, well, maybe over here when it talks about the Kohen Gadol not marrying a widow, it also means from Nisuin. So Dumya de Gerusha. No, the comparison that we want to make is between Nisuin and Gerushin. So Ma Gerusha Beimina Erusin Beimina Nisuin. When it comes to divorce, we learn that the divorce can be either from erusin or nisuin, and the woman is considered divorced and not allowed to marry any kohen. So af almana bein mina erusin bein mina nisuin. Doesn't make a difference whether it's from the erusin or from the nisuin. Tosfos asked the question. I don't understand. Maybe we could go in the opposite direction and say, oh, we have almana by Tamar, telling us that almana means mina nisuin. We have a connection between divorce and widowhood, and so maybe divorce is also only from nisuin. But he explains that what we have in that connection between divorce and widowhood is a hekesh. And when it comes to that kind of connection, a connection of some language, so we are going to usually be machmir and not use that to be lenient. Okay, so in any event, we now have an understanding of why our Mishnah needs to tell us that when we talk about a widow, it doesn't make a difference whether she's a widow from erusin or from nisuin. So now our Mishnah continued with the very important rule that we talked about before our Mishnah even, below Yisa as a bogeres. She's not allowed to marry as somebody who's turned 12 and a half. Now, Tana Rabbanan, we learned in a Brisa that's going to expand and explain these opinions. Okay, so let's take a look and see what they say. So, V'hu isha b'psulaha yikach. The relevant verse says that he, namely the Kohen Gadol, is only allowed to marry a woman in her virginity. Well, what does that come to exclude? Prat libogeres shekalo b'sulaha. It excludes a 12 and a half year old because her virginity has ended. Now, Divrei Rebbe Meir. That's what Rebbe Meir. So again, the Tanakama in our Mishnah, which is unmentioned, is Rebbe Meir, as we often say, Stam Mishnah Rebbe Meir he. But in any event, what does that mean that shekalo bisuaha? So Tosos explains that in the widest of the lines, and the second of the widest of the lines in Tosos, lav dafka kalu. It doesn't really mean that it completely ended. Elaklomar nismatu kitzas, namely the amount that a woman will bleed when her hymen is torn in connection with marital relations reduces over time, because the hymen and the amount that the vaginal canal is closed it expands over time as a woman gets older, and so as a result, that's why we want the Kohen Gadol to be ensured of that the woman is actually a virgin, and so we're going to require her to marry to marry someone at the age of under 12 and a half. So Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, Makshirin b'vogeres. Well, on the other hand, of course, Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon permit it. So, b'mai kamiflagi, what are they arguing about? Rabbi Meir Savar, Besula afilu mixas besulim mashma. That we're going to now take a look at that word bivsuleha and build it up. We're going to start with besula, because the Torah could have just said the who isha besula yikach, that he needs to take a virgin woman. Why did it say bivsuleha? So we're going to build up and understand what we would learn based on each level of the reading. So besula afilu mixas besula mashma. So if in fact it just said that she was a virgin, I might think that even a woman with only partial virginity would be allowed to marry him, meaning as long as there's some aspect of virginity left, she could be married. Bisuleha ad deika kola bisulim. But the fact that it says in her virginity, that tells us that in fact, the fact that it says her virginity, that shows an additional connection. And so as a result, it says that completely she needs to have her total virginity, and that's why it can't be a bogeres. Bivsuleha, and then we have the in her virginity. Well, now all of a sudden we have a location that's emphasized. Bit or in is suggests a location according to Rashi, and so therefore the kadarka in shelo kadarka lo. When we say that the woman needs to be a virgin, it means that she needs to be a virgin from having traditional marital relations, not non-traditional marital relations, namely anal relations. So as a result, an anal relationship would not, in fact, take away her virginity for the purposes of marrying a Kohen Gadol. So Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, Savre, and Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon disagree with the whole thing. They start at a different place and get to a different place. So Besula Shlema Mashma. They think that when it says that she needs to be, that it's a virgin, it means that she has to be a complete virgin. And Besuleha, when it then chooses, the Torah chooses not to just use the word Besula, but it chooses to use the word Besuleha, her virginity. So that teaches that all you need is a piece of her virginity. And so as a result, it's okay for her to be a bogeres. It's okay for her the hymen to have been reduced naturally. As long as it's there, it's okay. And bivsuleha, and then when it comes to saying in her virginity, achiyu kol besula kaimen, she needs all aspects of her virginity. And what do we mean by that? Bain b'kedarka, bain shelo kedarka. So when it comes to Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, although they are lenient with respect to the Kohen Gadol's ability to marry a bogeres, somebody who's 12 and a half, they are strict with respect to when it comes to traditional or untraditional marital relations. And they say that even untraditional, even anal marital relations would in fact cause her to be no longer considered a virgin who can marry a Kohen Gadol. So now that we've provided all of that rationale, so now we're going to discuss what happens if a Kohen Gadol, we're going to give Rav's ruling on this matter. So let's see how Rav rules. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda tells us that Rav said the following: Niv'ala shelo kedarka. If they had marital relations not in the normal way, psula l'kulona. So obviously he is holding like Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon. So Maisiv Rava asked the question, Velosiyet l'isha. We have a brisa that seems to suggest otherwise, because it says that she shall become his wife. The isha haru'uyala lo. This implies that it's got to be a woman who's fit to be his wife. Pratla almana l'choin gadol, garusha v'chalutza l'choin hedjot. And this comes to exclude a divorcee or a chalutza with an ordinary kohen. Now, what was this brisa talking about? This brisa was talking about if somebody raped somebody, in its attempt at that time to really be a progressive document, the Torah says that if somebody were to rape someone, and thereby effectively make it less likely that anybody would want to marry them, then the person who did the rape is obligated to marry the person and take care of that person. Now, the obligation, this brisa tells us, only applies to a situation where they're allowed to get married. So and so the question is, Heichi Dami, if you say that the Kohen Gadol had marital relations in a normal way with the woman that he raped, so my irya mishum almana. Why are you telling me that there's a problem with the woman being a widow? Tepukle mishum dehavya la beula. She's had marital relations. Yes, the marital relations were with the Kohen Gadol, but she's had marital relations. He's not allowed to marry a non-virgin, even if it was with him. So Elav Shalokadarka. So it must be that he raped her in a non-normal marital relationship. Umishum almana in mishum be'ulalo. And what the brisa is telling us is that it's a problem for him to marry her only because she's a widow and not because she's had marital relations, showing that marital relations that are not in the normal way, are not in the traditional way. So that means that it's doesn't prohibit a Kohen Gadol to marry. Well, that just disagreed with what Rav said. Rav said that even non-normal marital relations does prohibit the Kohen from marrying her. So how do we answer? So now we turn to Nun Tedam Abed, Hamani. Who is this brisa like? Who is the person, who is the authority who says that a non-normal marital relationship does not make a woman ineligible to marry a Kohen Gadol? Rabbi Meir, that's Rabbi Meir. The Rav disagrees with Rabbi Meir. To Amar Rabbi Elazar. He says like Rabbi Elazar. Well, okay. It's great that you're pointing out that there's an authority that Rav is like. However, even if Rav were to hold like Rabbi Elazar, we've got a problem, because Rabbi Elazar my irya mishum beula. So if Rav in fact holds like Rabbi Elazar, so then why when Rav made his statement, Rav said nivala shelo kedarka psula lechuna, that it was the intercourse, it seems, that causes her to be prohibited to the Kohen Gadol. So for why not tepuk the havila zona? Why not say that the problem is because she is promiscuous? She is a zona. She is not because if she had marital relations with anybody, that is an indication of her zona status. And so that should be the reason, according to Rebbe Lazar and according to Rav, who holds like Rebbe Lazar. Because what did Rebbe Lazar say? To Ha'amar Rebbe Lazar, Panui haba'al ha'panuya shelo l'shem ishus asa zona. Any man who sleeps with a woman, if they don't have an intent to get married, well, then that woman is considered a zona. And so as a result, even if they have relations shelo kedarka, even if they have non-traditional marital relations, she's to be considered a zona. And so as a result, that should be the reason that Rav says that a shelo kedarka marital relation woman is going to be prohibited to the Kohen Gadol. So Rav Yosef kigon shenivula b'behema. Well, one second. We don't have to assume that we're talking about a case of a man and a woman causing her to lose her have the non-natural relationship. It could be her with an animal. And maybe we'll say that when the animal causes her to have had relations, so she'll be no longer considered a virgin, even though it was shelo kedarka, even though it was non-traditional, namely anal, mishum zona leka, but she won't be considered a zona because she didn't have marital relations with another man. So Amar le Abaye says, I don't buy that. Mima nafshach. How could it be that she's not considered a zona? If she's considered a non-virgin, so zona nami havya, so then she should be considered a zona. Zona lo havya, and if you're not going to treat her as a zona, well then be'ula nami lo havya, she shouldn't be considered as a non-virgin. So okay, so we don't buy this animal status that the animal relations can get us there. So v'chitema midi dehavya amuka eitz shelo kedarka, and if you want to say that maybe sleeping with an animal should be just like with having relations with a piece of wood or being wounded by a piece of wood, meaning losing the hymen because of a piece of wood. Well, in Cain, and yet we're going to say that being wounded with a piece of wood, even shelo kedarka, meaning even anally, is going to be a problem. In Cain, there would be no one who would ever be allowed to marry somebody. Because the method of cleaning oneself after one having used the bathroom at that time was to use a stone, and that stone would naturally, to some degree, penetrate and thereby cause the same condition of that you would have of mukas eitz and yet we're saying that even doing that anally would cause her to be no longer capable of marrying the Kohen. So we can't say. So the bottom line is you can't say that either the anal penetration from an animal is like a human's anal penetration, and you can't say that we're going to treat it like a piece of wood, because either case is going to cause a problem to our understanding. So Rabbi Zera comes and rescues us and tells us how we can have a case with a woman who has had relations, shelo kedarka, has had anal relations with somebody, could be treated as a non-zona, and also not be somebody who was married, meaning not somebody who's divorced and not a widow. How can we have such a case? So the case is with a girl that refuses to continue her marriage. So as a reminder, what is the case that we're talking about? So if a father marries off his minor daughter, that is a fully biblical marriage. However, if the father is out of the picture for a variety of reasons, but for simplicity, let's talk about the simplest one, because the father has passed away, and now the mother and brothers try to marry her off. She is considered married, but she has the right until she turns 12 to refuse the marriage and effectively go free and not be married to the man any longer. And so such a girl could, if she only had anal relations with her husband during the time that they were married, and then she says, no, I don't want to be married to you. She's not considered divorced. She's not considered a widow. She's not considered a zona. And she did have anal relations. And so as a result, now we have the case where Rav could make his statement that it is only because she had anal relations that she's not allowed to marry a Kohen Gadol. So we might have thought that she could marry a Kohen Gadol. Rav tells us that he holds, like Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, that she cannot marry a Kohen Gadol. Okay, well, having talked about relations with an animal, we'll talk about a little bit more on that topic, and that will end our day. So Amar Rav Shimi Bar Chia says, Nivala levehema ksheira l'chahuna. If a woman had marital relations with an animal, then that does not cause her to be no longer able to marry a Kohen Gadol. Okay, and no longer be able to marry a Kohen. That's what it literally says, and we say that it actually even refers to a Kohen Gadol based on Rashi. So Tanya Nami Hachi, we actually have a brisa that teaches us this. Nivala l'misha enu ish. If she has relations with somebody who's not a human being, not a man, af al pi shebiskila, even though that's subject to the penalty of stoning, ksheira l'chahuna, she's allowed to marry a Kohen. She's not yet ineligible to marry a Kohen. Ki also Rav Dimi Amar, and when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, he said, Masa bariva achas behislu. There was a woman in Hislu. Shahaisa mechabedes es habayis. She was cleaning the floor of the house. Urava'a kelev kufri ma'achareha. And a dog, basically a wild dog, came and took her from behind. And Rebbe said she could still marry a Kohen. So Amar Shmuel l'Kohen Gadol. Not only could she marry a Kohen, she could even marry a Kohen Gadol. Well, 1 second. You may Rebbe Kohen Gadol mi hava. In the days of Rebbe, was there actually a Kohen Gadol? How could he be talking about saying that she's marrying a Kohen Gadol? Rebbe lived after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So Ella Ru'uya Kohen Gadol. What he meant is that Rebbe had said that she could have married a Kohen Gadol if, of course, a Kohen Gadol existed, but none actually existed at that time. So now, again, same topic. So Amar Le Rava, and it changed it here to Mi Parzakia, right? Rava from Parzakia said to Ravashi, Minaha Milsa de Amar Rabbanan. How do we know this law? Ains nos levehema, that there's no, it's not considered a zona relationship to have relations with an animal. It's prohibited and it's punishable with skila, but the woman is not considered a zona. Diksiv lo sivi esnan zona umchir keleb. The Torah has a prohibition of using certain funds or property as the method of acquiring a korban. So you're not allowed, once if money has been used to pay for a prostitute, so that money that has been used to pay for a prostitute can't now be used to buy a sacrifice for the Beis Hamikdash. And similarly, if you use money to buy a dog, so again, that money cannot be used to then buy a sacrifice. So usnan, and we learned in a Mishnah, what does it say? Esnan kelev umachir zona mutarin. If you reverse it and you go and you ask the pay for the hiring of a dog or the sale price of a zona. So what are those situations? So Rashi says that the hiring of a dog means that you pay a prostitute to have relations with a dog, or if you're and the exchange of a harlot is meaning if you have a slave that is a harlot and you sell her, the slave that's a prostitute and you sell her. So in both those instances, the money is not actually going to be prohibited to use to buy a sacrifice. Shneamar gam shnehem, meaning only the two things that were talked about in the pasuk, the esnan zona and the mechir keleb, only those two things are prohibited. Shnayim below arba, it's 2, not 4. Whereas if you were to say that the exchange for a harlot or the hire for a dog would also be prohibited. Well, now you have 4 categories in the pasuk. So we're not going to say that. So instead, there are only 2 categories in the pasuk that are prohibited. And so as a result, again, the basic point is that the payment of humans prostituting relationship with a prostitute is what is prohibited, to use those funds to buy a sacrifice. But if you were to pay a prostitute to have relations with an animal, those funds would not, in fact, be considered a problem to use to buy. Not saying that you should do that, but would not be a problem to use them to buy a sacrifice. And the reason is because from this we see that such a woman who were to sell herself to have relations with an animal is not considered a zonah, is not considered to be the kind of promiscuity that is in the category of zonah. So now that we've dealt with that, good to have that behind us. It's not easy to even to even mention and to talk about, but we'll get back to more traditional marital relations tomorrow, and in fact discuss the interesting case and interesting ramifications of what happens if the Kohen Gadol does marry somebody that he's not supposed to marry. Do we say that he has to get divorced? Do we not say that he has to get divorced? What's the status of her and him? Is he still considered a Kohen? Is he not considered a Kohen? What's the status of all of those people that are involved? So for all of that, stay tuned tomorrow and we'll learn those details then.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day.
Have a great day. We'll miss you tomorrow, right? You're out tomorrow as well?
Yes, I'm out
all right,
tomorrow.
well, we'll miss you tomorrow, but look forward to next time.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Right, tomorrow's Friday. Yes, so have a wonderful Shabbos.
You too.
And we'll look forward to learning together. Next week, Dov will be back on Monday and Tuesday.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.